The starship Unity floated in the vastness of space, an angular silver shape that glittered against the endless black. Inside its pristine walls, a meeting was taking place that would reshape the fate of humanity. Dr. Kalia paced along the observation deck, her eyes locked on the alien craft hovering just outside. It was far from the first contact Earth had made with extraterrestrial life, but this was different. The Zha'rians, a highly advanced species, had come not as conquerors but as benefactors. They promised an enhancement of the human race, a step forward in evolution. Kalia, however, was deeply skeptical. "This doesn't sit right," she muttered, tapping her datapad in frustration. "Why now? Why us?" Her colleague, Dr. Adrian Saris, leaned against the bulkhead, his eyes flicking nervously between Kalia and the Zha'rian vessel. "They're offering us immortality, Kalia. You can't tell me that doesn't intrigue you at least a little." Kalia scoffed, brushing her dark hair away from her face. "Oh, it intrigues me, all right, but nothing in the universe comes without a cost. Why would they do this for us? Out of the kindness of their hearts. They claim it's their duty to elevate less developed species," Adrian said. "A kind of galactic guardianship. We'd be the latest in a long line." Kalia sighed and turned to the observation window. The alien ship was sleek, its surface shifting with iridescent patterns that made it hard to focus on. The Zha'rians themselves had come aboard earlier, humanoid but with elongated, graceful limbs and deep violet eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone they looked at. Their leader, someone called Shizar, had delivered a brief but compelling offer, a genetic upgrade that would push humanity beyond its current limits. No more disease, longer lifespans, sharper intellect. It sounded too good to be true. "I just think we're playing with fire," Kalia said finally. "We don't know what this enhancement really entails." Adrian didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't know either. 2 days later, the process began. Across the globe, humanity's most brilliant minds, scientists, military personnel, and influential leaders had gathered in facilities like the one on Unity. The Zha'rians worked quickly and methodically, injecting a bright blue serum into each participant's bloodstream. It was explained as a genetic restructuring, meant to activate dormant potential within the human genome. At first, the results were spectacular. Subjects reported heightened senses, improved cognitive functions, increased physical endurance. One by one, the test groups marveled at their newfound abilities. It was a golden age in the making, the dawn of a new species. But then, the anomalies began. Kalia was the first to notice something wrong with one of their test subjects, a soldier named Evan Marik. She had been monitoring his vital signs when a strange spike in his brain activity made her pause. At first, it appeared to be an error, a glitch in the system. But then Marik's body began to tremble, his muscles seizing uncontrollably. "Adrian, get over here," Kalia shouted, rushing to Marik's side. The soldier was convulsing violently, his eyes wide but unseeing. His skin began to warp, bubbling as if something beneath it was struggling to break free. Adrian rushed in, his face pale as he saw the state Marik was in. "What the hell is happening?" "I don't know. His vitals are off the charts." Kalia fought to restrain the soldier, but it was like trying to hold down a wild animal. "Something's wrong with the enhancement. His body's rejecting it." Before Adrian could respond, Marik let out an inhuman scream. His muscles bulged grotesquely, and with a sickening crack, his bones began to shift. In a matter of seconds, the man had transformed from a well-built soldier into a monstrous, hulking figure. His face was distorted, his eyes bloodshot and filled with rage. "What have they done to him?" Adrian whispered, backing away. Marik, if it could still be called that, snarled and lunged toward them. Kalia barely had time to grab Adrian and dive behind a console before the beast slammed into the wall, metal buckling under its strength. "Security. We need backup in Lab 4," Kalia shouted into her communicator, but the words were barely out of her mouth before Marek crashed into another wall, tearing through it like paper. They weren't dealing with enhanced humans. They were dealing with something far worse. The Unity's corridors echoed with the sound of alarms as more reports flooded in. Throughout the ship, Others, like Marek, were undergoing similar transformations, their bodies twisting into grotesque shapes, their minds consumed by primal fury. What was meant to be a glorious step forward had turned into a nightmare. Kalia and Adrian managed to make it to the central command center, where the rest of the Unity's crew had gathered in a panic. Commander Jaros, the ship's stern leader, slammed his fist on the console as another report came through. "The enhancements have failed across all test subjects," he growled. "We've got monsters running rampant in every section of the ship." "They weren't enhancements," Kalia said, out of breath. "They were ... mutations. The Zha'rians must have known this would happen." Commander Jaros turned to her, his face dark with anger. "You think this was intentional?" "They said they've done this with other species," Adrian said, his voice shaky. "Maybe this is their way of wiping out potential threats before they even arise." Jaros cursed under his breath. "We need to evacuate and warn Earth." A deep, resonating voice interrupted them. The Zha'rian leader, Shizar, appeared on the main screen, his violet eyes gleaming with an eerie calm. "Evacuation will not be possible," Shizar said. "The transformation is irreversible, and containment is now impossible. We did not foresee this outcome in your kind." "What did you do to us?" Jaros demanded, his fists clenched. Shizar blinked, as though the commander's anger was a mild inconvenience. "We sought to improve your species, to elevate you beyond your primitive state, but your genetic makeup is unstable. The enhancement triggered something within you, something far more dangerous than we anticipated." Kalia stepped forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "You mean you unleashed monsters on our people?" Shizar tilted his head. "Monsters? No. What you are witnessing is not a failure, Dr. Vieres. It is the true nature of your species revealed. You were always meant for something greater ... but also far more destructive." Before anyone could respond, the screen went black. Jaros turned to the remaining crew. "We need to get this under control. Start sealing off the affected areas. We can't let those things get to the escape pods." Across the ship, chaos reigned. What had once been humanity's finest soldiers, scientists, and scholars were now monstrous abominations. They tore through bulkheads, devoured anything in their path, and hunted the remaining crew with terrifying precision. Kalia, Adrian, and a small group of survivors made their way to the armory, where they hoped to regroup and formulate a plan. The corridors were eerily quiet, but Kalia could feel the tension thick in the air. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant sound made her heart race. The ship's artificial lighting flickered, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. "They're hunting us," Adrian whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the emergency lights. "They're not just mindless beasts. There's a purpose behind their movements." Kalia nodded grimly. "We've unlocked something deep in our DNA, something ancient, and now it's taking over." As they approached the armory, the group was suddenly ambushed. A hulking figure, once a man, now a snarling beast, lunged from a side passage. It swatted one of the crew members aside like a rag doll, sending them crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Kalia raised her plasma rifle and fired, the shot hitting the creature square in the chest. But it barely staggered. "Fall back," Jaros shouted, opening fire alongside her. The corridor erupted in gunfire, the plasma bolts lighting up the space with blue and red flares. The creature roared, charging forward with terrifying speed. Another crew member was grabbed and torn apart before they could even scream. "Keep moving," Kalia yelled, firing shot after shot. The creature seemed unstoppable, its flesh knitting back together even as it took damage. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the corridor as Adrian, eyes wide with fear and determination, hurled an explosive charge toward the creature. It detonated with a deafening roar, sending debris and smoke billowing down the passage. When the dust settled, the beast was nothing more than a charred husk. Adrian collapsed to the floor, panting. That was too close. Jaros grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. "We've got to keep moving. There'll be more of them." Inside the armory, the survivors gathered what weapons they could. The situation was growing more dire by the second. The creatures were evolving, becoming more organized, more intelligent. They're learning, Kalia said, staring at the tactical display. If we don't find a way to stop them, they'll take over the entire ship. Adrian wiped sweat from his brow. If this spreads to Earth. Kalia shook her head, refusing to think about that possibility. We can't let it. We need to find a way to shut them down. Maybe if we can disrupt the genetic mutation. Zha'ros cut her off. Even if we could, we don't have the time. They're already everywhere. Suddenly the door to the armory rattled violently. Something was outside. Something big. They found us, Adrian whispered. The door began to buckle under the force of repeated blows. The survivors raised their weapons, their faces grim with the knowledge that this might be their final stand. And then, with a deafening crash, the door gave way. The door exploded inward, debris scattering across the armory like shrapnel. A massive creature barreled through the breach, far larger than the others they had encountered. Its hulking frame was covered in thick, sinewy muscle, and its distorted features barely resembled a human face anymore. Black, viscous liquid dripped from its jaws, and its eyes, small, red, and burning with intelligence, locked onto them with terrifying focus. Fire, Zha'ros shouted, unleashing a volley of plasma rounds. The rest of the survivors followed suit, filling the room with blinding light and the acrid scent of scorched metal. But even as the plasma bolts tore into its flesh, the creature charged forward. It moved with terrifying speed for something its size, closing the distance between them in seconds. Fall back, Kalia yelled, grabbing Adrian and pulling him behind a stack of munitions crates just as the beast crashed into their defensive line. One of the crew, a soldier named Harlow, was caught in its grasp. With a sickening crunch, the creature crushed Harlow's body and flung him aside like a broken doll. The others kept firing, but it was clear this thing was stronger than anything they'd faced so far. We can't stop it, Adrian shouted, panic creeping into his voice. We have to try, Kalia barked back, gritting her teeth. Zha'ros, showing no fear, grabbed a high-powered energy cannon from the weapons cache and took aim. Clear the way, he ordered. The remaining survivors dove for cover as Zha'ros squeezed the trigger. The cannon unleashed a powerful burst of energy, the recoil nearly knocking him off his feet. The blast hit the creature square in the chest, sending it skidding back across the floor with a roar of rage. For a moment, the thing seemed dazed. But just as Kalia allowed herself a sliver of hope, the creature shook off the blow like it was nothing. It pushed itself upright, its wounds already closing. This isn't working, Adrian yelled, firing uselessly at the beast. It's regenerating too fast. Kalia's mind raced. They couldn't keep fighting like this. If the creature reached them, they were dead. But then something clicked in her head. She remembered the Zha'rians' words, how the transformation was irreversible, how this was the true nature of humanity. There had to be a way to disrupt it. Adrian, she shouted, crawling over to where he was crouched. We need to overload the power grid. We can use the ship's reactor to send a shockwave through the genetic material. If we disrupt the mutations at the molecular level, it might stop them from regenerating. Adrian's eyes widened. That's insane. We could blow the whole ship apart. Do you have a better idea? Kalia snapped. Zha'ros overheard them and nodded grimly. She's right. We're not going to survive this unless we go all in. If we die here, we die fighting. Kalia turned to the commander. We need to get to the reactor core. If we can rig an overload, we might be able to take out the creatures, or at least buy Earth some time. Zha'ros looked at the monster, which was already charging at them again. Then we better move. Fast. Getting to the reactor was easier said than done. As Kalia, Adrian, Zha'ros, and the last few survivors made their way through the Unity's corridors, the sounds of destruction echoed around them. The ship had become a battleground, with mutated creatures ripping through metal walls like tissue paper, and those crew members who hadn't yet succumbed to the mutation fighting a desperate, losing battle. The closer they got to the reactor core, the worse the situation became. They passed groups of twisted, half-mutated beings once human, now something entirely different, snarling and tearing at anything that moved. Kalia had to fight the bile rising in her throat as they came across the remains of several engineers, their bodies shredded beyond recognition. But there was no time for grief. The reactor room was just ahead. Zha'ros took point, scanning the area for threats. "Looks clear," he said, motioning for them to follow. As they entered the reactor chamber, Kalia felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. It was quiet here, unnervingly so. The massive fusion reactor, a towering cylindrical structure pulsing with energy, hummed softly in the center of the room. It was the beating heart of the Unity, and it was about to become their last-ditch weapon. "Okay," Adrian said, his hands shaking as he began pulling up the reactor controls. "I'll need a few minutes to set the overload. Once it's primed, we'll have maybe 10 minutes to get to the escape pods before it goes critical." Kalia nodded, keeping her eyes on the entrance. "Just make it fast." Zha'ros, pacing near the door, grunted. "We don't have long. Those things are going to figure out where we went." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the door buckled. The surviving crew raised their weapons, hearts pounding. Another massive creature slammed into the door from the other side, its furious growls growing louder with each impact. "Adrian, hurry," Kalia shouted, leveling her rifle at the door. "I'm trying." Adrian's fingers flew over the console, typing in commands as quickly as his panic-fueled mind could manage. The door groaned, bending inward. A long, clawed arm reached through the gap, ripping apart the reinforced metal. "Contact in 30 seconds," Zha'ros barked, readying his energy cannon again. Kalia fired a warning shot at the arm, but the creature didn't seem to notice. "We're out of time," she yelled. Just as the door tore completely open, Adrian slammed his hand down on the final command. "Done. Reactor overload in 10 minutes," he shouted. The first creature barreled through, roaring in rage. But before it could attack, Zha'ros fired his cannon again, hitting it with a point-blank blast that sent it flying back through the door. "Move," Zha'ros shouted. "Now." The survivors sprinted down the corridor, the ship shaking around them as the reactor's power levels began to spike. More creatures poured into the hallway, some charging on all fours, others slinking along the walls like insects. The group fired as they ran, but it was a losing battle. One by one, they fell to the creatures' relentless attacks. By the time they reached the escape pod bay, only Kalia, Adrian, and Zha'ros remained. "Get in," Zha'ros shouted, pushing Adrian toward the closest pod. The ship was tearing itself apart. Explosions rocked the hull as the reactor went critical, and the mutated creatures swarmed toward them, desperate to stop their escape. As Kalia and Adrian scrambled into the pod, Zha'ros turned back, his face set in a grim expression. "Zha'ros, come on," Kalia shouted. But the commander shook his head. "Someone's got to hold them off." Before Kalia could protest, he slammed the pod door shut. Through the small viewport, she saw him fire his cannon one last time, holding the creatures at bay as the escape pod launched into space. The Unity exploded in a brilliant flash of light behind them, a massive shockwave rippling out into the void. Kalia and Adrian watched in silence as the debris scattered, the once great starship reduced to nothing more than fragments drifting through space. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence in the pod was deafening, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them like a physical force. "Do you think it's over?" Adrian asked quietly, his voice hoarse. Kalia didn't answer immediately. She stared out at the stars, her mind racing. They had destroyed the ship, the creatures, but the Zha'rians were still out there, and they had learned something terrifying about humanity. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I don't think this was the end." Adrian looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" Kalia's eyes darkened, her thoughts drifting to the serum the Zha'rians had injected into them, the genetic manipulation, the mutations. "It's still inside us." "Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They awakened something in our DNA, something we can't just destroy." Adrian paled. "You think it's still in us?" Kalia nodded. "We don't know what's been set in motion. We survived the ship, but we're still carriers of whatever the Zha'rians triggered. And if we make it back to Earth, she trailed off, the implications hanging in the air like a death sentence. Adrian swallowed hard. Then what do we do? Kalia stared out into the endless black, the faint glimmer of distant stars offering no comfort. The escape pod drifted, silent and alone, toward an uncertain future. We figure it out, she said softly, before it figures us out. Adrian sat in stunned silence, digesting Kalia's words. The faint hum of the escape pod's engines was the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. The vast expanse of space stretched out before them, cold and indifferent. Neither of them had expected this survival now felt like a hollow victory. Kalia stared out the viewport, her mind racing through all the possibilities, the potential horrors they might have brought with them. Whatever had been unleashed on the Unity wasn't just a physical mutation, it was a dormant, primal force that the Zha'rians had triggered. They had tampered with humanity's genetic code, not knowing or perhaps knowing all too well what they were waking. Adrian finally broke the silence, his voice shaky. What if we're already changing? Kalia turned to him, meeting his eyes. Fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion were etched across his face. She could see the question burning there, the same one she had been asking herself since the ship's destruction. Could the mutations start in them too? Were they already infected, carrying the same potential for monstrous transformation as the others? She placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to steady both of them. We haven't shown any signs, not yet, she said. We're still ourselves. But we have to be careful. We need to isolate ourselves when we get back. No contact with anyone else until we're sure. Adrian nodded, though the fear hadn't left his eyes. Do you think Earth will even listen? When they hear what happened, they'll panic. They'll want answers. They'll have to listen, Kalia said firmly. We'll explain everything, the Zha'rians, the experiment, the mutations. Earth has protocols for this kind of thing. Quarantine measures. They'll know what to do. But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. Humanity might not fully understand the risk, not until it was too late. She had seen what happened to the crew aboard Unity, the speed with which the transformations occurred, the savagery of the creatures that had once been human. If something like that spread on Earth. No, she couldn't allow herself to think that way. They still had time. They could stop this before it became an even bigger nightmare. Adrian's voice interrupted her thoughts again. What about the Zha'rians? They're still out there. Do you think they'll try this again with someone else? Kalia frowned, her fingers tightening into a fist. The Zha'rians had manipulated them, treated humanity like an experiment. The thought of them moving on to another species, unleashing the same horror on unsuspecting civilizations, filled her with a cold rage. I don't know what their plan is, she said softly, but we'll make sure Earth knows who they are and what they've done. We'll make sure they're stopped. Adrian's expression hardened. And if they come for us again? Kalia's gaze drifted back to the stars. We'll be ready. The pod continued its slow journey through the dark, heading back toward Earth and an uncertain future. The enormity of what they had survived weighed on both of them, but there was something else too, a flicker of hope. If they could make it back and warn the planet in time, if they could stop the Zha'rians and prevent the spread of the mutation, maybe there was still a chance to contain the threat. They had lost so much friends, colleagues, and the Unity itself, but they had survived. And as long as they were alive, they still had the power to fight back. Kalia leaned back in her seat, exhaustion finally catching up with her. We're not alone in this, Adrian. Humanity's stronger than they think. We'll find a way to beat this. Adrian gave a weary nod, but the weight in the air didn't lift. The shadow of what had been unleashed still loomed large in both their minds. The Zha'rians had opened a door they couldn't close, and now Kalia and Adrian carried the key back to Earth. For now, though, they had to trust that they had enough time to act, enough time to stop this before it got worse. As they drifted through the void, a quiet resolve settled over them. They weren't just running from the horror that had consumed the Unity. They were racing to prevent its spread. Whatever the future held, they would face it head-on, armed with the knowledge of what had nearly destroyed them. Kalia stared out the viewport one last time, the stars burning bright in the endless dark. Whatever had been awakened in humanity, it wasn't going to win. They wouldn't let it. And as the escape pod continued toward Earth, the faint blue dot in the distance, they knew they had one mission: to make sure no one else unleashed what lay hidden inside humanity's very DNA.